My conversation today is with Sky Mathis, a modern seeker of truth and student of the occult arts and sciences, and host of one of the most beloved podcasts in the esoteric and adjacent communities today, Philosophical Minds. It's been my great pleasure to get to know and become friends with Sky. His hosting style is inquisitive, engaging, sincere, and unique, and his outlook has been an inspiration throughout my own endeavors in podcasting. Sky has interviewed some of the most influential and significant personalities in the occult and esoteric communities. His guest list reads like a who's who in the fields of esotericism, alchemy, magic, quantum spirituality, environmentalism, and just about every other niche corner of interest in the digital world and beyond. We sat down to talk about podcasting, alchemy, current social issues and trends, and being a human being. I always learn a lot from Sky, and I hope you'll get as much from this conversation as I did. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast. It's time. It's time the world know my dark, filthy secret. I'm a pipe smoker.
Ooh, what is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What do you got? Tobacco?
I got I have a little
You have a sorry, cut out.
I have a little bit of like aromatic tobacco, but I usually smoke like Virginia Perique. If I were to smoke that now, it'd be like having 3 shots of espresso. So like I'm not gonna do that. I just have like an aromatic, and I put some Egyptian blue lotus on top of it. It kind of relaxes me. Some people say it's a placebo, but I mean my formula is if it works, use it.
Totally. Yeah, everybody's kind of different too, and how their bodies respond. I've got a lot of different blue lotus stuff I like to play with as well. I've got like a tincture that my buddy made. It's like a 1-to-1 hemp blue lotus formula that I'll take every once in a while and kind of experiment with. So that's kind of cool. I don't think I smoked the flat.
You know so many alchemists. It's like wild. And all of them are like top tier.
I try to find individuals that are practicing that can provide experiential information, and like, you know, people that are actually doing the work and have experience, and kind of like found a little niche community actually on Instagram. Kind of interestingly, you know, it's funny, we think about social media a lot of times with all the toxicity that it can have, but there is value there if you find it. You just gotta try to know what you're looking for, and then find the people that you can talk to that are willing to talk to you and extract the information that you're seeking. And that's what I try to do. And I'm so interested in all the different versions and interpretations and alchemies of all different sorts, because there's just a lot of different opinions, and there's a lot of different even practical practices within alchemy, different paths and all of that. So I love it all, honestly.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I mean, that's how you and I kind of got in touch, was social media. And it's definitely particularly, you know, you introducing me to Phoenix, that has kind of, I don't want to say it's changed the course of my focus, because it hasn't, because it's like once you kind of go a certain length along the way of initiatic stuff, like that's just what you're going to do for the rest of your life. But it has augmented my work to the point where now I'm like seriously working to make the 7 dailies, of the spagyrics and all that stuff. And I mean, I kind of was already getting set up to do you know I was growing by I was doing biodynamic growing principles, moon phases, and kind of doing my best to separate everything into these planetary correspondences. But it's hard. You got to kind of just do it on your own, because everybody has different correspondences and no two sources are the same. So I was already doing that, and now I'm just kind of really interested in this alchemical lab work, taking it one bite at a time. But that's because of really listening to your show and listening to Phoenix. I mean, the conversation you had with Robert Allen Bartlett was like phenomenal, man.
Yeah, he's another. I mean, he's a legend, because even a lot of the people that I've interviewed have studied under him too. So it's like, you can judge a person by their fruits, and there's a lot of people, a lot of alchemists that I've spoken to that have learned a lot from him and then built upon what they've learned from him as well. So, I mean, he's just amazing, because he comes from studying under Frater Albertus, and the whole lineage that goes along with all of that, the PRS Society. And I think it was actually Phoenix too that had inherited a lot of the laboratory equipment and books and all of that from Frater Albertus as well. Yeah. So Phoenix is another huge one. I mean, it's crazy because he's been at it for so long and coming at it from every different angle. So he's just got a lot of experience and different perspectives that he just gets you really fired up and inspired. I totally could see how you'd be inspired by talking with him.
Yeah. So at any point, were you interested in practical alchemy? Like seriously? Because you are a well-rounded person. When I hear you talk with your guests, your guest list is consistently impressive to me. I feel like I am very small potatoes, which is a good thing. That's where I like to be. I like to be around people who know more, who are more well versed. If you're the biggest fish in the pond, you're in the wrong pond. But the interesting thing to me is how well rounded you are. But when I hear you talk about alchemy, I'm actually very impressed to hear how much you know, and at such a, you can talk about it on such a high level. At least that's what it seems like from your interviews. So I'm not trying to pull the curtain back here. It's just a compliment.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely very interested in actually, practical laboratory alchemy, and I want very badly to be more deeply engaged with all of that when I have the right amount of time that I can allocate towards it, because I want to, when I do start engaging it, I want to do it at a more focused and proficient, non-distracted level. So my approach has been, my goal has been to interview and talk with the smartest and the most experienced alchemists practicing that I can, and get all their different perspectives, so that I can have a really good foundation to begin working on these things for myself, and then have those resources kind of built up to be able to utilize, have those connections established to be able to, draw upon. And that's kind of been one of my goals with the podcast, among other goals. But I'm, sometimes when you're in situations, maybe you can't pay for travel. Maybe you don't have the ability to travel somewhere and go learn from any particular individual out of state or out of country. for me, it's been about trying to find them, communicate with them, and answer the questions I can, and try to fill in all the gaps with my interviews. I have it all on the record, and I can kind of pull from it. And I try to just kind of brainwash myself with all this information as much as I can, and try to embed it into my mind because I'm so interested in it. So that's kind of, one of my main goals. I'm trying to build a super, super solid foundation for all the different possibilities. So then I can kind of have all this to work with. And then I want to eventually definitely go into the practical, experiential aspects of everything.
Yeah. I've been very, very surprised at how frequently I've been able to change my mind or revise something in doing this podcasting thing. I think it's been really cool to do it. It's been also been extremely challenging. I'm not somebody who likes to craft a conversation. I'm somebody who just likes to have them. So in that sense, it's a little difficult because I feel like I could just shoot the shit with anybody. But, obviously you have established authors and stuff that don't know you from a hole in the wall. And they're just sitting there kind of like, yes, ask, and I'm like, like I don't know how to do that. but it's been really interesting it's been really interesting to see how much of like a metanoia in certain instances I've been able to have by these conversations. And I feel like I'm at a point right now where I'm just all the walls are just being blown apart right now, because I think I did the right thing in terms of an initiatic lineage. I fully just focused for several years, not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, 7 years. I focused on one thing, and I know it really, really well. I just so happen to have the good fortune that system is itself a little bit of everything. So now I'm kind of, I'm well-rounded enough to be able to talk to people about things, but my preconceived notions are being destroyed by these conversations, and it's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. That's like one of the, I feel like with podcasting or just opening yourself up to having conversations and talking about anything that you're interested in, whether it's alchemy or fitness or biology or physics or whatever, if you're going to be someone that engages in multiple conversations with multiple individuals that have different perspectives and come at things from different angles, you're inevitably going to run up against that. And so one of the early podcasts that because I was inspired to start my podcast by a bunch of other podcasts that I'd listened to, and one of them was called, I think it was Mixed Mental Arts. It was with Brian Callen and a guy named Hunter Motz. It was a great podcast, and it was really fun to listen to because they talked a lot about, a lot of different philosophical stuff, and they would talk about, different, like, holding multiple perspectives and opposing perspectives in your mind at the same time, and how they would, go through all these different sort of mental challenges that you would have to overcome in order to be able to basically like unlearn and then relearn what you think you knew about anything. And in order to progress and like evolve and push forward, you have to be able to adopt and integrate new ideas and get rid of the old ones that aren't as valuable anymore. And it's like, I think Joe Rogan always talks about, like, it's like in the world of ideas, you can only beat one idea with a better idea. And you can't just stick to your idea for the sake of sticking to it and being egotistical and thinking that this is the one and only idea that is gonna withstand time, and this is the idea that I have, and it is the way that it is, and it's the only way. It's like, that's like a rigid ideology. And rigid ideologies are not the way to go. Like, you have to be flexible, and you have to be adaptive, and you have to learn to integrate and build upon and expand and evolve and all of that. And so I think listening to a lot of other podcasts early on kind of, pushed me towards creating this podcast and really inspired me. And I've kind of kept that in the back of my mind and tried to always not get too certain of anything, because I found that you can't be too certain of anything these days. It's like we're in the state where we're kind of reevaluating, the fundamental nature of things. So I'm trying to be open. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about different perspectives and formulate, something that resembles reality in terms of things that can be replicated. If you're using like the original scientific method or whatever, things that you can replicate, whether that be, like in your line of passion, the magical realm, it might seem to others like it's something that is non-compatible with maybe modern day scientific perspectives. But when you do those operations, as you've spoken to, in certain ways, with certain paths, you arrive at certain conclusions and certain results, and that's a repeatable process that you can replicate. So that's kind of been my whole approach.
We say that magic is not scientific, but it is empirical. I think actually, I think Evo might have said that, but I find it brilliant. It absolutely is. But that's the interesting thing. I think that's what makes you a great podcast host, is the openness that you have. And that was one of the first things that really struck me about you, because it's a keynote to every conversation you have. You ask questions from a place of almost like this aporia. It's kind of like, so in the Socratic dialogues, like Socrates goes on to like challenge these big names, right? And he says that look, seriously, I just want you to explain what you think you know to me, because I don't know anything. I'm approaching it like a babe. But the interesting thing is that, like, you read those dialogues, and that's not how he comes across. He comes across like he's intentionally goading you, and he's already had this conversation in his head. He knows exactly where to corner you, but I get more of a sincere vibe that you are actually on that tack of like, no, I want you to explain it to me because I want to hear your thoughts. And it makes it really, really comfortable for people, I think, to come on to your podcast. And it makes it easy to listen to, because most people that listen to this stuff have the same questions and do not have, they don't have the level of just baseline knowledge of this stuff to really be able to dig in. I think that, if you hear like two established alchemists talking about alchemy, it's like listening to something in Chinese. Whereas you can listen, you can have a conversation with an alchemist, and then like a lay person can then understand that. We can extract value from that conversation,
Yeah, I remember, man, I don't remember when it was. There used to be this website, I think it still exists. It's called sacredtexts.com, and it had all these different like books that they would publish on there, all different kinds of alchemy books and everything. And, I'm very interested in religion and just different perspectives and all of that. So I remember browsing through these websites. I think it might have been one of the first when I came across, Hermes Trismegistus and all of these various alchemical texts, and reading some of them. And, the language is very veiled and confusing. And I'm like, man, this is so confusing. And sometimes I would seek out texts that haven't been translated, and I use like Google Translate and try to translate them, and it was really crappy the way that it came out. And I would try to like decipher it, And it got me somewhere, you know, it got me to where I can have questions to ask. And I was like, I wish there was a way that this information could be made more clear. Like, not a lot of people, at least at that time, I had not come across a lot of people that were talking about it. So I just began to seek out anybody that was talking about any of it and try to get my questions answered. And, you know, that eventually kind of evolved into sort of where it's at now. And I will say there are instances where I do have an idea of where I think a guest might go with an answer in regards to a question that I ask. So it's not always that I ask a question with no expectation. I do ask questions sometimes with the expectation that the guest will answer in a specific way because I've listened to them before, but it's something that I want to extract and, you know, bring out of them for the sake of providing a good quality response that can be heard by the listener, which I do think is part of the art of this whole podcasting thing that we're doing. So I think there's value in that too. I just try not to be rude or aggressive about how I got that.
That's great. Noted.
Yeah.
No, it's really cool. So that's how the podcast kind of started, just this kind of genuine, sincere sort of attempt to seek out the most knowledgeable people about certain fields in philosophy and esotericism, and just learn from them.
It's definitely, yeah, a lot of it. I would listen to a variety of different podcasts where they would have on guests and be talking about subjects that I was interested in. And I'd always be like, oh man, why didn't you ask this? Or why didn't you ask that? And I would want these questions to be answered. And then one of the podcasts that I'm a big fan of is called the Tinfoil Hat Podcast. The host, it's three dudes. It's Sam Tripoli, Johnny Woodard, and Xavier, I forget his last name, but they're great. They're fun. They're funny. You know, Sam's a comedian, but they explore a lot of, you know, fringe and esoteric subject matters too. Those guys were a big inspiration for me as well. But I think he had said something. He's like, if you think you can do this, start your own podcast, ask your own question, or something like kind of like, you know, because he would get criticism, people complaining about whatever, you know. I'm sure, like, why didn't you ask this? Just like what I'm thinking in my head. He's like, start your own podcast, do it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, that's what I need to do. Like, I need to start my own podcast. And as much as it's not necessarily my comfort zone, like public speaking is something that for me, I do, like, naturally. I don't have that proclivity, but at the same time, I know that there's a value in trying to challenge yourself and fill in those gaps in your life where you maybe feel like you're nervous about something, or you don't necessarily want to do it because you're afraid or whatever, and how that can increase and expand your potential. And just, you know, so that's another motivation, like trying to just be a better, well-rounded person, I guess. Push myself.
Yeah. And that kind of it I guess your overall approach towards these things kind of ties into a little bit about what we wanted to talk about this evening, which I think principally one of the things that we wanted to touch on was this kind of middle way, you know, this middle path between two extremes. It takes a little bit of this kind of receptive component or passive component, and it takes a little bit of this active component. And I think that one of the most interesting things about the way that we conceptualize balance, you know, and this middle path that's constantly referred to, it's constantly referred to in Taoism and Christianity, you know, esotericism. The interesting thing about how we conceptualize it is that you say balance, and people kind of picture something that's very rigid, you know, and really we exist in a material realm where everything is constantly in motion. You know, as I sit here, this solid desk, it only appears to be at rest, right? And so there's something that drives students of the occult crazy. You tell them balance, they find the middle way, and they become so fraught with anxiety that it's like, you know, it's when I was doing postural assessments in like physical therapy and massage therapy, two fields that I worked in, you'd say, oh, if you tell somebody, okay, stand up straight, they automatically do this. It's like, well, that's not straight. So you need to sort of goad them into it, trick them into it, and you tell them, okay, just walk in place until I say stop. And then you say stop at a random point, and that's their natural posture most of the time. You kind of have to catch them off guard.
Yes.
And that is, you know, you can assess their balance from that. And you can't, everybody has this contour, this natural contour, this way that they find their center of gravity and balance themselves, and it can't really be exemplified. You can't tell somebody what it looks like. You have to show them how it feels and help them find that, and that's kind of the middle way for each individual person, at least I have found. But it is there, but it's more of a dynamic equilibrium. It's like, it's kind of this, like a sine wave, but I picture it like vertically, you know? And the thing is, you know, you start out like this, trying to find the middle way, and then over time it's just less and less, and you're less at extremes. But that's kind of the way that I conceptualize this idea of balance and finding the middle way. Do you agree with that? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. And first, I want to ask, how much time do we have for this? Because I have some different ideas of how to go about this, but I want to know, are we at what's our time limit right now?
There is no time limit tonight because my girlfriend's out of town, and this is going to be the inaugural episode of season 2 because I'm so stoked and proud to have you as my guest. So we'll go as long as you want to.
Okay, cool. Because one of the things that I love to emphasize, and I kind of reiterated this point on another interview that I did recently, was like in terms of balance and in terms of alchemy and podcasting and conversing about the subject, there, ironically, because obviously there's spiritual alchemy, and then there's the practical laboratory alchemy, kind of, you know, one of the physical and then the spiritual, so to speak. And I feel like there is an overemphasis, in particular right now, in terms of people discussing the spiritual aspects of alchemy. And I think that is ultimately the most important aspects to be discussed, though. But I feel like people often shy away from the actual laboratory applications of things and how those are kind of correlated to and mirror the spiritual aspects of alchemy. And so one of my goals is always to try to cover both. And I've maybe emphasized a little bit more and tried to extract a lot more of the information on the actual practical and experiential operative alchemical processes and operations and such, because it's something that needs, in my opinion, to be brought more to the forefront and looked at, because it helps give a more holistic view of the entirety of the picture. So I thought it might be fun to, maybe I could walk through some of the practical aspects, just to give, maybe a little taste of some interesting things that not a lot of people speak about. I think for your podcast, it'd be really cool, because I haven't heard any of your guests so far speak to a lot of these things, but it could give people more of a deeper insight in that regard. And then I definitely want to touch on like more of the spiritual and middle path of alchemy kind of ideas that I wanted to talk about with you, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. It's so funny because for the last like 2 or 3 days while I wait for my primary literature to come in, I've been looking all over the internet for some kind of interview with someone I trust about, the basic steps of practical alchemy, and I've not been able to find a single decent one. So, I mean, this is very synchronistic right now. So go ahead, have at it.
All right. Well, I'm gonna enter into I'm gonna go straight to one of the paths to the stone, the philosopher's stone, because on my last interview that I did the kind of went over my brief, probably not exactly accurate, but the best I could do, understanding of the Flamel path. So I thought on yours I'd go about the acetate path, which is one that a lot of people have been said to have had a lot more success with, and so I wanted to go over this one. So this is one of the many, because there are many paths to the stone, the philosopher's stone, the material philosopher's stone. The acetate path in particular, aka it's also referred to as the work of Saturn. And this is like in regards to the whole hieroglyphic tradition around it. This is, some would say, the most ancient. I think that's debatable though, and precedes the Flamel path at least. But, it goes way back to a woman named Mary the Jewess, or Mary the prophetess, that lived in Alexandria. And it seems that there's definitely like alchemical works and records even prior to hers. But there was I think there was a Roman emperor at one point, Diocletian, I believe it was, who destroyed all the records essentially because he was like afraid that gold production would destroy the economy or whatever. So I guess the earliest source that we have modern day is Zosmos of Panopolis. After Diocletian's rulership in like 300 AD, he recorded in his Encyclopedia of Chemistry all kinds of stuff, which included the writings of Mary the prophetess. So it's indicative that some information did survive, and Zosmos helped kind of disseminate that. And so over time, the alchemical streams eventually made their way like into Portugal and Spain via like the Crusades and the 1100s. So they started kind of translating a bunch of old Arabic alchemical texts, and they got a hold of, they got a hold of them and interpreted, translated into a bunch of different languages. Some of the texts describe that like the Arabs basically learned from the Greeks, who got it from the ancient Egyptians. And, it came into Spain, and it gets picked up by, I guess, according to a lot of people, this Christian missionary, Raymond Lull, who published a bunch of texts. And maybe it was him, or maybe it was people writing under his name, but nonetheless, you can find these texts under the name Raymond Lull or Raymond Lully. So it comes into Spain, it gets picked up by him. And there was another guy named Arnold de Villanova, same kind of story. Eventually time goes by. And then we got Sir George Ripley. He comes into play in like the 1400s, publishes a bunch more texts, kind of a little bit more clarifying and perpetuating the same sort of stuff that Raymond Lull and Arnold de Villanova were producing. And interestingly, just like a side note, because I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but Ripley, he was a canon as well at the Priory of St. Augustine in Yorkshire. So he was like a Catholic priest. So they all basically veiled a lot of this information in hermetic encoded language using like winemaking symbolism and metaphors, And that's just kind of how the language that they use to veil the information or whatever. So kind of getting into it. So say you have your flask or your philosophical egg or your chimera or the womb, so to speak, that you'll use. Get your crude matter, galena ore primarily. Take your metal and you oxidize it, then then it reacts with acetic acid. This is the acetate path. So first off, actually, I'll explain that it's believed that all metals and minerals grew out of one sort of primordial substance, like a slimy-like substance or chaos matter that is essentially like the physical representation of the non-physical primordial chaos, which you could like read about in like the Golden Chain of Homer. And it's believed that just as plants or roots grow and evolve, so do metals in the earth. They grow and they evolve and they ripen out of this substance. And, inside the earth, that's like the realm that they grow and they thrive in. So the understanding is that all metals are basically just gold in various states of evolution. We say we mine an ore of tin or copper or whatever. Those are just different states, according to the alchemists, those are different states of gold in its evolutionary process. So, say we find like copper or silver, just a particular stage. It's a very slow, long process of evolving towards gold. And then we mine them, we take them out of the inner earth environment. It would be like basically taking a fish out of water, or like if we were to like take an orange fruit that was growing on a tree, like in its early stage, it's like little and it's green. And if we pluck it off the tree, it's going to stop its evolution at that particular stage in its natural growth process. And it's going to be halted because it's being stripped from the vegetative life force source that's facilitating and feeding its growth. So the goal is, how does one figure out the developmental stages and processes and science of the evolution of gold and then accelerate that process? So anyway, you get your crude matter, you get your lead, your galena, your ore, you reverse engineer it back to its chaos state or the original substance that it grew from. And then you put it through a series of processes where you're essentially evolving it in an accelerated way. So you take your lead, you bring it to its acetate state. So like the acid of vinegar or acetic acid, you want to get that naturally produced in particular. You get your galena, crush it up, heat it till it's basically fully oxidized. You take your oxidized lead, your lead tetraoxide, and you dissolve that into acetic acid. Remove that excess, and then you have your red or green, or what's often referred to in a lot of these old texts as the Saracon gum. And then the acid, it digests the lead, and the lead atoms, quote unquote, become bound to the acetic acid ions. So you have this like gummy substance composed of lead, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. So the alchemical understanding of this was that in the process, the vegetative life ether from the acetic acid has basically migrated into the quote unquote lead atom. And they used to think that this substance that we have now was the metallic primordial like chaos, but it wasn't necessarily. And I'll kind of like go on to explain why that is. And so if I recall, you do a pyrolytic fractional elemental distillation of your Saracon gum, and you go from there's like the water that comes over, then the air, the fire. The air would probably be like the gases. Fire, the earth. Earth is going to be like your residual salts. You arrive at your components. You got like a liquid, a gas, an oil, and a mineral. In the end, once you do all these elemental distillations. So like my friend Trevor Polinsky, on one of the interviews that I did with him, he explained it like he used like negative 60 degrees. He did like a quadruple dry ice slurry cold trap and like 6 different condensers to try to keep the gases like all at bay from escaping, because you want and you need them for your end product. So you're basically you're pyrolytically beginning to break down the atomic bonds that hold everything together via these different separations. And the last remaining compound in the bottom of the flask is going to be like your residual mineral component containing primarily lead coated in carbon. So here's like kind of the crazy part. So aside from the non-organic components, aside from the lead coated carbon, everything else that comes over during the distillation and ends up in the receiving flask when distilled, the oxygen, hydrogen, carbon components, when they all come over and cool down, once they cool down again, they kind of like magnetically rebind. And that coating phase, or that cooling phase, once they're recombining, this recombination phase creates new substances that did not exist before the original starting substance. And this is like something that science is basically, as we know it, is unable to explain how this phenomena happens. So you end up with like acetone and other things, and then like a red oil that's composed of like phenolic compounds, and like a little bit of carbon and lead comes over, but that's mostly going to be left over in the bottom of the flask. But yeah, mostly the acetone and the red phenolic compounds, which are also referred to as the sun and the moon. So now you have what you need to produce what's called the philosophical mercury out of the sun and the moon, the acetone and these red phenols, which the acetone's not just acetone. There's other things in it. I don't exactly remember what it is. And some will argue that this is the only substance that can dissolve metals, in particular gold. But there's also, there's something called aqua regia, or there's a philosophical mercury of urine as well. And from my understanding, talking with Benjamin Terrell of the Temple of Mercury, basically you need something with like a chloride ion and an oxidizing agent like a nitrate, and you can dissolve gold. But anyway, in this traditional acetate path, it uses this particular form of philosophic mercury, because if you look in the literature of alchemy, you'll find all different kinds of descriptions of what philosophical mercury is, and there's all different kinds of descriptions of different philosophical mercuries. But in regards to the acetate path, this philosophical mercury, it changes the nature of the lead or the gold or whatever to where it's no longer like a metallic substance, and it goes through I think it's called like a radical dissolution, where you can regress your metal back to its like true or actual primordial chaos state. But I think it's definitely debatable in terms of like other paths, with you being able to also use things like aqua regia or philosophical mercury derived from urine and so on. But so you use this philosophical mercury applied to silver or gold to radically dissolve one of them, and you arrive at this state, and you merge this with the residual remaining salts to get basically the ferment of gold or silver, or the seeds of gold or silver. So this part I'm not exactly clear, but I'm pretty sure you combine this with the residual, let's say like Saturn salts, or the lead salts that are remaining in the flask, and arrive basically at your stone. And the red stone is going to be the stone basically associated with what's being used when you're dissolving this using gold, and then the white stone is another one that's produced when you're using silver. So you could take that and then you can multiply. And it's said that the amount of the stone that you mix with lead can convert like 10,000 times its volume of lead into gold. So you can like also increase the power of its multiplication action or whatever, you can take some of your original acetone, and acetone, it there's other things in it. Like I said, I don't remember what they are. Take this original acetone with the original phenols, and then you redigest, and you come to what's called, I think it was like the azeotrope, and you, which is like a homogeneous. You're arriving at a homogeneous compound. And so you dissolve your stone in that again, and you redigest it until it forms a crystal again, essentially. And every time you do this, you're essentially multiplying its power of quote unquote transmutation. Like from, say, like when I was saying you could do 1,000 times its volume into lead, instead of 1,000, it'd be like 10,000 times its volume. So this is the idea of multiplication. And then when it comes to like obtaining the seed of gold, you also hear guys like, Robert Bartlett talk about it being contained within the scoria of antimony, which you probably have listened to if you listen to our podcast. And that is probably in regards to maybe like the flamel path, not necessarily the acetate path, I don't think. But yeah, the scoria or the glassy slag that he refers to, it could also be used as the seed, like the seed of gold that's contained within it. You could basically grow gold like you would a plant.
Yeah,
so if it's put into the right soil.
That's one of the things that was so like mind blowing to me that I think needs a slight bit of explanation, is this idea that metals can have seeds, that they grow, that they multiply, but over just vast periods of time, like imperceptibly slow, I think was the way that you guys had put it. But because if you hear like seeds of metals and you're not familiar with that that kind of alchemical concept, you're just kind of like, all right, I'm lost.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the idea, like, in regards to that, is that like if you find gold in its natural environment and the surrounding like minerals that it's contained within, you find, there's what's present. There's like pyrite or arsenic and quartz and so on. So you basically, the idea is that you want to create that sort of environment to take your ferment, your gold ferment, and incubate it like with proper heat, proper period of time. And the heat factor, I think, is a big point, because this is what's helping accelerate the process in terms of like in nature, this heat wouldn't be exposed to it. It would be over such a long period of time that it would take that heat to have that effect to increase and expand the growth and create the conditions that would facilitate this sort of evolution where the elements would react in certain ways to facilitate the growth. But when you're taking it into your hands as an alchemist, you're analyzing and you're looking at these processes, and you're creating the environment yourself, and you're accelerating it. Like it's all about like accelerating a process that is a natural process, in my understanding at least. And I'm probably screwing a lot of things up, but I feel like even if I am, it's important that somebody tries to put these ideas out there, and I'm happily would love for anybody to come and correct them.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is there's a lot of parallels. There's a lot here. Particularly stuff relating to Zosimos of Panoplis. That just sticking out in my head is that, so you guys talk about practical alchemy. I can hang at this point. I understand what a pyrolytic distillation is. Like it's just burning something to release. It's a dry distillation to release the quote unquote vapors, the air and all that stuff. But where like my mind automatically goes is there are so many parallels to the initiatic path. And you can even find them in like Zosimos of Panoplis wrote about his allegories were wacky, like scary, like priests bleeding out of their eyes and stuff. But there's something that there's a particular thing that he talks about that is, there are a couple of things within his like super famous work. I'm not exactly sure what the name of it is right now. I'd have to look it up. But I was reading it the other day, and it's a lot. Some of the things are found in like Masonic ritual, which is really, really crazy. It's there's this alchemical component to Masonic ritual that again, I always give this caveat, at least in the North Carolina iteration of these rituals in our district, but that are highly, highly alchemical. And you're talking about basically what spiritual alchemy in things like the Golden Dawn attempt to accomplish. And it's kind of something that we say, and it's really interesting because I was just having a conversation about exactly that with Aaron Leach. You're expediting karma. You're doing to yourself what would take lifetimes for nature to accomplish.
That's why I love like having these conversations with somebody like you that's familiar with all of that sort of background, is because you can lend a lot of insight into that sort of realm that can bridge and connect the two worlds of the physical and the spiritual. And that is like right where we get to like, things like the middle way. And that's what it's all about, is like, it's not just one thing. It's not just the physical. It's not just the spiritual, but it's both. And we have to acknowledge both. So like, we're talking about like the alchemy of the middle way. Like there's a lot to cover, but it like to be aware of the extremities of things. I know it's like moderation. It sounds so boring, but in actuality, it's like the sustainable and harmonious way to go. And it doesn't necessarily mean complete neutrality either. It's not to be confused with stagnation. I think that's important. Like you can moderately progress the amount of weights that you lift at the gym over time versus going from like 10 pounds to 100 right away. I mean, you're just going to get injured that way. And over time, once you build that capacity to 100 pounds via your moderate progression, you have now cultivated essentially like a playground of possibilities, and you can operate within that expanded range of capacity of freedom that you've cultivated for yourself. Just kind of like how you've spoken to before in terms of learning an instrument. I think you said something totally along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, because it boils down to patience and discipline, which are kind of, they go hand in hand. They're kind of the same thing. And what a lot of people don't understand is that those are spiritual disciplines. Those are, if we're talking about practical alchemy as, if we want to just dip back to it as a kind of a correlation, it's taking two things and having, a third thing be. So one of the things that I do is I make soap. I've made soap for several years now. I hand make it.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, I taught a class on it for the first time last weekend. It was a hit. But the interesting thing is that even in that kind of basic chemistry, you're taking sodium hydroxide, which is lye, which is found naturally. It's not it doesn't have to be synthesized. It's just water leaching through potash, burnt wood. And so it's sodium hydroxide solution, meaning with water. And then you have some kind of fat, oil. Those two things come together, science is happening, but they become soap. And the thing is, people are always kind of like, well, how can it be soap? Is it dangerous? It's got lye in it. First of all, the only way anything can be considered soap is if it has three ingredients: lye, water, and fat. Look that up. That if it doesn't have those three ingredients, it's not soap. But what happens is, the reason that is because these chemical things come together, these naturally occurring things come together and they create a third thing. And this process by which soap is created is called saponification. And at the end of that process, it is soap. It's no longer fat, lye, and water. It's something chemically completely different. And that's essentially a perfect analogy for what happens to the self when you introduce patience and discipline. It allows you to become that third thing.
Ooh, saponification. That's a nice word. I love that.
Yeah.
And I love this. I love that you're doing that. I try to move more and more towards that, whole approach. My cousin, she actually makes our laundry detergent, and I don't exactly remember all the ingredients, but she makes it from, well, the minimum ingredients, whatever it is. It's a lot cheaper, works great. You don't have to deal with all the unnecessary chemicals that you're buying from laundry detergents at the store. And that's not to criticize anybody that's using laundry detergent, because I totally understand. But I think that it's really cool to kind of move in that direction of trying to come more and more closer to the like the natural, or closer to the truth, just avoiding any unnecessary things that you don't need in anything that you're doing. And whether that's the things that you're applying to your body, things that you're applying to your diet, the things that you're applying to your mental diet, anything like that. So I love that. And discipline that you mentioned, I always love to refer. There's the quote. It's very popular now. I think it's Jocko Willink. Discipline equals freedom. I know he's kind of like a hard-ass personality and all of that, but I think he's so right. I couldn't agree more. When I first heard it, it was a little confusing for me, and now I'm totally on board. I agree 100%. So I always like to reiterate, discipline does equal freedom, and I think you just illustrated that exactly with what you were saying.
Yeah, I am 1,000% on board with that. I've read his book, Discipline Equals Freedom, and it's just I don't understand. It's hard for me to wrap my head around why that needs to be said, but it's a powerful thing. It's almost like an occult secret. It really is. People scratch their heads at it, and it's like, look, if you can't, the whole idea behind why discipline is freedom is because we're constantly given a choice, what is best and what is easy. Okay. And they're never really the same thing. If you don't have the freedom to choose, then you're not free. It's not a choice. So, what gives you the ability to choose? Discipline gives you the ability to choose, regardless of how you feel about it. So, I mean, it's making, to go back very quickly to making soap. This is another reason why I'm attracted to doing practical alchemy. I get to take things that occur in nature, right? Like we're talking about, and put them together and watch nature, science, whatever you want to call it, do something that I am just there to assist having happen, right? I mean, again, I use a stick blender. They used to make soap in like this gigantic cauldron, right? And the washwomen would sit outside in the center of the town and they'd stir the cauldron like the entire day. And then they just have this big block of soap that people would chip off and take home. So that was an all day thing. Whereas like I have technology, I have a stick blender, and it takes me 20 minutes to assist these chemicals to the saponification process enough to where I can batch it. And it helps you really become acquainted with natural processes and become an agent in them, which is, I don't know, it grounds you. It connects you to life.
Totally. I think it's like, because there's also this perspective, if people don't understand, maybe it's all new to them. They think of this idea, maybe in general chemistry or whatever, they think of it as if it's an intervention and you're messing with nature. But in reality, when you're doing things properly, it's more like you're co-creating and becoming an agent of working with nature, and you're becoming involved in what nature is doing, and you are yourself a product of nature. And so I think that kind of when you're saying that, that's what it makes me think of. And I don't know, kind of coming back to the extremities thing though, like I think it's important, like becoming aware of the consequences of extreme behavior or reactions to the principle of cause and effect. Like I think that's so huge too, because being aware of the potentiality of things as like psychological or emotional levels of things, like unconscious projections, perhaps if someone has harmed you and you haven't properly processed any particular trauma, then that emotion or energy is stored up somewhere, and it's eventually going to go somewhere for better or worse. And say if you're abused by a 50-year-old man, maybe you're more easily triggered around a 50-year-old man. But ideally you'd want to aim to like transmute these things with a gentle ingenuity versus risking some kind of explosion in the quote unquote flask of your psychic experience or your psychic field, so to speak. So right now, to me, from my vantage point, if I look out into the collective, there's a lot of turbulence and transitions taking place both internally and externally, and this reemergence and domino effect of basically being forced to like reevaluate nature and the nature of truth and reality. Political systems are shifting, financial systems are transitioning, technology is evolving, and people are having to keep up with all of it and just do their best to function. And that's why I really love that phrase, kind of coming back to earlier, that what I was saying about flexibility. There's this phrase, improvatus apto quod victim, to improvise, adapt, and overcome. And I think that's such a middle way sort of quote and antidote. And in my opinion, what, we should all embody. And I'm not trying to necessarily like tell people what to do. I'm just giving my genuine impressions and attempts at solutions in regards to the times, because we can spend, all of our hours complaining about shit that sucks with all these various issues. At some point we need to improvise, adapt, and overcome. And, there's another cheesy quote, to be the change that you want to see in the world. Like anybody can simply philosophize a solution, like complaining about like littering or something, like trash on the side of the freeway. The freeways, they have so much trash. What's wrong with people? Somebody should come and pick this trash up. The government should come and pick all this trash up. La 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 la. Like, no. Like, be very careful and aware of the consequences and the cause and effect of getting into the habit of outsourcing anything within your sphere of influence to any corporation or government or entity, especially one that doesn't necessarily have a good track record and your best interest in mind, and it's not have a good track record of reciprocal benefit. Like, you be the change, you be the person that you would love to see picking up the trash, and watch how your whole perspective shifts. Like, I think that's so important.
Yeah, and what's also interesting about that alchemically, at least from a philosophical point of view, is like you're saying, be the change, but also adapt, improvise, and overcome. So adapting to the change, like for instance, probably about 10, 15 years ago, I was a little bit more, how should I put this? I was a little bit more of a bleeding heart, a little bit more on the softer side. And some of that had to do with age, and some of that had to do with the fact that that was not the prevailing paradigm of the society in which I found myself. And so I felt like I had to present a counterforce to that within my sphere of influence in order to balance it out, because the mass of people it being a mass, right? It containing so much energy, such a powerful egregore, is constantly at the extremes. Whereas now we're shifting to the same arc, just in a different extreme. And I find myself gravitating more towards the other direction. And so in that sense, I'm adapting, intentionally adapting myself to be a counter ingredient or a counter element to something that I find to be just this constant extreme. And where we find ourselves when we do that is being Mercury, because Mercury is the androgyne, right? It is that rebus state. In other words, you have, so you've got the active and the passive, the celestial niter and the celestial salt, that sort of that primary duality that come from the prima materia, the first monad. And then from there, you have the divisions of the four elements and the tria prima. So you've got, fire and air being the active, water and earth being the passive. You've got sulfur, which partakes of the both active elements, fire and air. And you have salt, which partakes of both passive elements, water and earth. But you have Mercury that partakes in the middle of one active and one passive. And therefore, when a Mercury presents itself to us in alchemical verbiage, it means this neutral state. Mercury can be active, it can be passive, it can be male, it can be female, and therein lies the adaptability.
100,000,000%. That was beautiful. That was like a beautiful breakdown. And I think, like, kind of along those lines, like Joe Rogan, of course, he says it best. He says, be the hero of your own movie. And I agree 1,000%. In whatever way, like whatever that means to your unique soul trajectory, be the hero of your own life. But I kind of want to go back to the extremities of things on that note, and like the whole cultural polarization and manifestations occurring because it's happening on like so many levels. But with men and women in particular, masculinity and femininity, there's like this concern of the perpetual trajectory of the male patriarchy and the fears that persist in regards to the male dominated institutions and maintaining power positions. And then we've got like the concern of the war on the masculine, in particular, like the masculine being expressed through men, which in general is kind of like the natural proclivity. And there's this woman, Callie Brogan, a female author, who she very much embodies and connects with her femininity, by the way. But she goes as far as to describe it as an energetic castration. And she goes into the whole damaging effects of this sort of quote unquote agenda that she calls it on the population. And, you often hear guys like Jordan Peterson touching on all of this stuff in detail. So it's in the air, and we have valid concerns with all of these sort of things. And there's healthy and unhealthy responses occurring and playing out right now from different individuals and groups. So like my message, and like, I think exactly what you're mirroring, like, I feel compelled to put it out there because it's just something I'm passionate about, especially in these times of transitions, to be aware that fear, it has a tendency to override your reason or cloud your rationality. And if you allow it, it can definitely have the tendency to steer you wrong. So I say, like, yes, definitely acknowledge and discuss these issues in an honest and open way, and don't shy away from them out of fear. And becoming fearful or angry about anything can lead to acting impulsively. And unless you're in a literal self-defense type situation, impulsivity is not ideal. It's not helpful for anyone to go from thinking that because, say for so many years there was a patriarchy, that we should now have an exclusive matriarchy where now only women should lead in positions of power. That's not helpful.
And then
it's not helpful as a man.
what you end up with then is you end up with the masculinization of the feminine, and that is the problem is that it's been such it's been the air that we've breathed for so long that we completely take it for granted, that these attributes of that we find valuable, particularly in commerce and things like that, are, and have been, well, at the very least, they were established in a period of male dominancy, and therefore are absolutely a reflection of male masculine values. And this holdover of that entire system, but just wanting to exchange one group of people for another, but yet still insert it into that exact, that's not, it's kind of like it's kind of like what man, I forget her name, in the first Batman movie, Batman Begins, Chris Nolan's Batman movie, when he's talking about when Bruce Wayne is talking about shooting Joe Chill in the court. He brings a gun and she just goes, "That's not justice, that's revenge." It's the same thing. The issue is that you're cutting your nose to spite your face, because most of the people that you want to see fall haven't done a thing to you, as individuals.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing, because you're just constantly setting yourself back into the trap of the agenda. There's absolutely an agenda. And to your point about fear, is that you can make someone predictable. You will be better poised to predict their next move if you force them into being reactive. And what does fear do? It makes you react. It doesn't make you're going to respond in, yes, as you say, impulsive but imminently predictable ways. And we just saw that. I'm not going to go into that, but we just saw all that happen in real time. It's like chess. There's two ways to get somebody. You either scare the shit out of them by putting them in check and get them in a corner, or you lull them into a false sense of security. Those are great strategies for making someone act in a way that you want them to act, that causes you to have an advantage.
It's almost as if it's been done by design, perhaps. Absolutely. Yeah. That's where, like, the approach of the middle way is so important. Like, kind of on the same note, also, it's not helpful, as a man, to remain dismissive of, say, like, the reality of a woman's menstrual cycle, or become ignorant of the magic of a female's biological reproductive power and take that all for granted. Like, I totally 100% acknowledge that whole aspect and that whole perspective as well. And it's not helpful to allow yourself to be possessed by any sort of popular movement that claims superiority in either camp, like black or white or man or female. It's not the solution to overvalue the divine feminine or overvalue the divine masculine. To place one as superior to the other, I think, is a huge mistake. And I speak to this so passionately because I see it manifesting, out there in different forms. And, biologically, in terms of sex, each sex has its own complementary gifts to offer that can be appreciated and honored. In terms of, gender roles, it's important to emphasize that masculinity or femininity, those can be found within both sexes at different levels of expression. Like you can have like a strong muscular man that displays very nurturing feminine qualities, or maybe like a petite female with painted nails and her hair all did, that's very assertive in terms of like a masculine disposition in terms of her style. And within all these things playing out, like in nature, everything ebbs and flows, and there's always rising and falling psychologically potent egregores like how you had mentioned earlier, of emotionally charged ideologies, some of which arise organically as responses to sociological environments or evolutionary progressions in consciousness, others of which arise artificially and are quite literally manufactured as cultural or psychological warfare tactics by tyrannical, narcissistic sociopaths that basically want to divide and conquer. So something to keep in mind, like, polarities, they don't exist for the flourishing of divisiveness and conflict. Polarities can be complementary and work with each other in a unifying way that, that's how nature creates. Like,
Exactly.
we're all one thing. We're just individuations.
It's and nature actually. So there's this idea, again, when I was studying biochemistry, there's this idea of enzymatic substrate interaction. And essentially it's this model of lock and key, where it's like this particular, the substrate of the enzyme, the way it's able to, and you see this even in neurochemistry, there's a receptor and then there's, a chemical or a compound or something. And it's a lock and key model. And essentially you find that all the way down in nature. You find it on microcosmic, or, in that case, microscopic, but microcosmic and macrocosmic levels. And we forget society, forget who's got to stay home and wash the dishes and who's got to go out and earn the bread. If we strip all that shit aside, we just need each other mentally, emotionally, physically. Dion Fortune has a really she's got a really interesting way of talking about how men are more active in their physical being, but on the emotional level they're more passive, and then above that, on the mental level, again, they're more active. And then on the spiritual level, they're more passive. And there's an inverse of that to the feminine. Now, again, these are all generalities, but they help in having us make sense, right? I mean, that's why the Hermetic perspective is so important. A Hermetist, and that was brought forward in time by the Rosicrucians, reads the book of nature, because that is our best bet as to how this entire thing relates to the spiritual, it is an analogy of spiritual principles. It can point us to the way that things work. But, there's that Edenic story of and I think we touched on it in the last podcast I did with you on esoteric Christianity. But if I didn't, it's worth also reiterating this idea of, like, Adam or Eve being taken from Adam's rib. To me, I don't view that as, like, yeah, absolutely, Adam was most likely, if we're looking at it in a literary context, the product of he came first because he was the product of men writing this stuff, conceptualizing this stuff, writing it down. But the idea is what's important, the fact that we were a unity. And in the material realm, we are now a duality. You don't get back to the holism by subjugating one over the other. It's like, okay, I'm in charge of this shit now. It's like, well, good luck, because again, now we're at extremes. We're not working from the point of balanced power, and the only way that we do that is to work together to each other's strengths and weaknesses.
Hell yes. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Dion Fortune too. I think you were actually the one that got me onto Dion Fortune. She's so fantastic. I've been kind of going into her writings lately. But yeah, another thing on the subject, kind of, going back to latching on to social movements, some of which, they may be intentionally weaponized, because you see people who put their souls on pause and hand over their allegiances to these social movements, and it's just sad and it's gross. And so like in terms of like instances of comedy, especially if your friends or family are joking around, like pay more attention to the intention of a thing. Like comedy, like stand-up comedy in particular, is one of the, I personally regard it as one of the highest art forms. Like the ability to transmute all of these kind of things we've been talking about into laughter, to take insecurities and judgment and fears and self-deprivation and past traumas and all that, and transmute them into like pure golden laughter and joy. To me, is like one of the most amazing things to witness. And so I'm like personally a giant advocate and proponent of comedy and comedians and, you know, freedom of speech. And I bring this up because it comes down to kind of deciphering intentionality. And I personally, I love like dark humor and preposterous, free-spirited, say what's on your mind displays of well-crafted bits that don't necessarily conform to any political correct narrative, you know, making fun of anything and everything, black, white, gay, straight, rich, poor, just doing funny accents and doing impressions and mockery. And it's amazing and beautiful. And I'm grateful that there's a place for it. And what it does, like why it's so valuable, is it provides this space for this sort of transmutation, to use like an alchemical term, to occur in the best possible way. Like you find out a lot about yourself in terms of what makes you maybe feel uncomfortable, or why maybe there's something to look at. And the results is 90% of the people like that I see in the crowd after a good comedy show, they walk out feeling happy and they're smiling, and they probably, a lot of them think like, it's okay. Turns out that we're all a little fucked up in our own ways and in our own different ways, and it's okay. Like I can acknowledge it and hell, even laugh about it. And they're like, it's like this idea of loosening up and releasing a sort of pressure of like, wow, this person just articulated so many points about psychology and society, and it's beautiful. And basically it's dangerous to assume things, and it teaches you, when you're assuming things, I mean, it's bad, but it teaches you to be less judgmental. And it's okay to make, you know, jokes and laugh if you're someone who's like overly serious all the time and you're so rigid about every little thing. Like it's like, what kind of life are you really living? So I don't know, I always encourage people to maybe explore things like that, especially these days, in terms of just trying to go and enjoy a comedy show and maybe just listen and try to have fun and listen to what they're saying and see what comes up for you. Because from my experience, it's been one of the things that I really enjoy, that helps me, I don't know, like just understand a lot more about human nature and society in general, and be able to be okay with it and have a sense of humor about it. Because it's like, we can't always be so serious all the time. We gotta like have some laughter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of comedy. I don't know if you can call like mainstream comedy anymore. It's not funny. But you know, that's why like the advent of YouTube and podcasts and stuff, people are just like, I'm gonna do it over here, because it's the censorship is stifling. And somebody once said that being human is a guarantee of injustice. And yeah, we carry that tension around silently, constantly. Some sort of injustice, some sort of insecurity, some sort of projection or defense mechanism. We carry it around silently. And when you don't call things out, when you don't talk about them, they have a way of haunting you. The tension builds to almost this powder keg situation, and it has to go somewhere. Like you were saying earlier, it has to go somewhere. It will. It's just whether or not it's going to go somewhere productive and whether or not you can be able to control it. And when we laugh at these things because people call them out, it's diffusing the power, that its hold on us. That underlying tension is released, because it's all through us. We're just vessels of everything. Nothing truly in that realm exists unless we manifest it. We express it in some way. And to take all that injustice and all that tension and to turn it into laughter, that's alchemical. You turn a poison into a balm. You didn't take something else and add it to it. You took what was there and you brought it to light. And that's why comedy is so important. And to me, right, in all this spiritual work, one of the biggest risks, you spend so much time worrying about yourself, your own complexes, your own behavior, your own transmutation. Everything becomes about you, and things become very, very heavy all the time. It's always about the next spiritual checkpoint. That's not something you achieve. Okay, you don't achieve those things, but we work at it as if that's the case. And to me, there are two surefire ways to tell if you're making progress on the spiritual path. The first one is, how do you feel? How do you behave when somebody you know, or somebody you like, or somebody you don't like, begins succeeding? How do you feel? That will tell you a lot about how far you've come. The second thing is, can you laugh at yourself? Not just alone, but in a room full of people. Can you laugh at yourself? Laughter. Do you know the story about Theseus and the Minotaur, the Greek myth?
No, tell me about it.
Just very briefly. So Theseus goes. He's the son of a king. He goes to Crete, to King Minos, whose wife had an affair with a bull, and they had to put what it created, the Minotaur, this half man, half bull beast that just needs to devour Athenian children, right? The king of Crete, King Minos, asks for every year they have to, or every 5 years they have to send like 10 children over so that they give the Minotaur something. It's this big kind of just nightmare for the Athenians. So the King Aegeus, his son Theseus, goes out on a brave quest, and he says, I'm going to slay this Minotaur. No more. We're not giving him any more kids. This thing's an abomination. So the Minotaur was kept in the middle of this like labyrinthian maze. While Theseus is there, he's like, I know I can kill this thing, but I won't make it out of the maze alive. King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, she falls in love with Theseus. And she has a spindle. She likes to weave. And so what she does is she says, Theseus, take this end of my string and bring it into the labyrinth with you, so that when I will weave this string for you so you can find your way out after you've killed the Minotaur. Theseus kills the Minotaur, and he follows he would have died in there if it wasn't for her thread, the Ariadnean thread. And to me, laughter is the Ariadnean thread that God gives us, so that no matter what happens here, I'll find my way out.
Oh man, I love that. Yeah, that's such an important point. Yeah, and I think we've probably all heard of a Karen. Poor Karens out there. I know there's a lot of amazing Karens, but it's become sort of like a personality archetype at this point. Like, a lot of us recognize now that it's this kind of personality archetype or individual that is just kind of looking to be offended, kind of just looking for something to criticize and like nitpicking. I don't know. Moral of the story is, don't be a Karen, I guess. But yeah.
Except if you're Karen. I'm sorry.
Except if you are a genuine Karen.
Yeah. Or if your name's Karen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much more I got on the whole middle way thought, but anything else you want to ask me, go ahead, I guess.
No, I mean, I loved that because, I think one of the reasons that you and I got along right off the gate is because, like, we've never talked about this stuff before, but I felt an underlying kind of sympathy towards that very balanced perspective. We all, of necessity, have to interface with the world, and so we present a certain way. We have to. But I think that one of the ways you present yourself has always, in my estimation, been indicative. It has sort of betrayed an underlying balance in you. And, I'm glad we got to have this conversation and sort of, fleshed out some ideas that are not, a lot of people don't want to touch these things. FYI, I will talk about this stuff at a drop of a hat. Anytime you want to, we can talk about politics, religion. Like, I don't care how anyone feels about this stuff. Because we're not saying anything to hurt anybody's feelings. We're talking like human beings, and that's really where we have to get back to, this center point, this where we can all kind of relate to each other. And you don't always get to express your thoughts on these matters on your podcast. So I'm really, really glad that you did it on mine.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that's where I'm at as well. It's hard sometimes when you're engaging in conversation with other individuals, you don't want to offend anybody because you do appreciate them and their perspective and where they come from. So for me, it's not necessarily my intention always to project or install or infuse my opinion within any of my interviews or conversations. But I definitely do appreciate and thank you for kind of providing me the space today to just provide and, give me the space to express some of my thoughts that I am passionate about, because something that I don't usually do. A lot of people do ask me, they do want to hear more about my opinions of things, and here it is, I guess. So
it's great, man. You're consistently one of my favorite people to talk to. So I hope that we don't go too long without having somebody on someone's podcast again.
For sure.
All right. Thank you. Sky Mathis, Philosophical Minds Podcast. Have a good night, man.
You too, brother.